The unseen compass. Principles. The very word might stir different reactions within us: respect, resistance, or even indifference. But regardless of how we feel about them, principles quietly shape every corner of our lives. Some principles we inherit from family, passed down like heirlooms of wisdom. Others we learn through painful mistakes, carved into our character like scars after hard lessons. But no matter how they arrive, principles stand as the unseen compass that guides our journey through the complexities of life. Picture a river winding through a forest. It doesn't flow aimlessly. It's guided by the riverbanks, yet it doesn't resist the path. It finds grace within the boundaries, carving its way forward. Like the river, we too need direction, not to be caged in, but to flow purposefully. This is the role of principles, not to constrain us, but to give form to the force of our lives. But why do we need principles at all? At our core, we are creatures of instinct. We seek comfort and pleasure, avoiding hardship at all costs. It's our nature to chase the things that make us feel good, whether that's recognition, comfort, or fleeting joy, and to resist discomfort, whether it's the sting of criticism, the weight of responsibility, or the pain of loss. And yet, if we lived solely by instinct, we'd be pulled in countless directions, losing sight of what truly matters. Our instincts would prioritize short-term relief over long-term growth. We'd take the easy road over the meaningful one. Principles exist to help us tame that inner chaos, to remind us that true peace isn't found in indulgence, but in alignment with ourselves, with others, and with the greater purpose of life. Think of the moments when life feels its hardest, when we face temptation, conflict, or uncertainty. In those moments, we often seek something solid to hold on to, something that can help us stay steady in the storm. That something is principle. It whispers to us that it's better to be honest than to win through deceit, that it's better to be kind than to be cruel in the name of victory, that patience will serve us better than anger, even when anger feels justified. Principles remind us of who we want to be, not just in our brightest moments, but when the path is darkest. But here's a hard truth. Principles aren't always comfortable. In fact, they rarely are. They ask us to resist urges, to sacrifice comfort, and to endure struggle. They may even make us feel isolated at times when others around us choose easier, faster paths. It can feel unfair when those who seem to ignore principles rise quickly while we climb slowly and carefully. It's tempting to think, why bother? Why hold myself to this standard if no one else seems to care? But the truth is, principles are not about what others see. They're about what you know within yourself. They're the silent choices that no one may ever praise, but that build a foundation of resilience and integrity that no circumstance can shatter. In our modern world, it can feel as though principles are outdated relics, too rigid, too slow in a world that moves fast. We're often encouraged to break the rules, to disrupt, to stand out at all costs. And while innovation and courage are crucial, they're not the same as recklessness. Some people mistake rebellion for greatness, thinking that defying every rule makes them exceptional. But there's a difference between knowing when to challenge a principle out of wisdom and rejecting it simply for attention or convenience. Consider this. Imagine a society with no shared principles, where honesty is optional, promises mean nothing, and respect is forgotten. It wouldn't take long for chaos to take root. Principles aren't meant to suppress individuality. They exist so that individuality can thrive without harming others. They give us the freedom to live together in peace, knowing that we can trust each other's actions and intentions. Yet, principles aren't infallible. Some are timeless, rooted in compassion, truth, and justice. Others may be temporary, shaped by cultural beliefs or outdated fears. And this is where discernment comes in. It's not enough to follow principles blindly. We must ask, is this principle helping or harming? Is it guiding me toward growth, or is it a shield I'm hiding behind? The goal isn't to be rigid, it's to be wise. Principles should be tools of liberation, not barriers that imprison us. Ultimately, principles are like the beams of a house. They provide structure, but they must be flexible enough to withstand life's storms. They remind us that strength doesn't come from resisting every challenge, but from holding firm to our values, even when it's inconvenient or difficult. And when used well, principles don't just keep us grounded, they help us rise. As we move forward in this story, I invite you to reflect. What principles guide your life? Are they the ones you've chosen intentionally, or ones you've inherited without question? Are they still serving you, or have they become burdens? Remember, principles are not meant to trap you. They're meant to set you free. And sometimes, the greatest act of freedom is not to abandon principles, but to embody them fully, knowing that within their quiet strength lies the key to lasting peace. So, with this in mind, let's explore not just what principles are, but how they shape the stories of our lives, guiding us, challenging us, and, in their own quiet way, leading us home. Principles as life's discipline. Discipline, it's a word that often feels heavy. It's like a burden we're asked to carry. But at its core, discipline isn't about punishment. It's about strength. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when the heart longs for comfort and the mind seeks distraction. And principles? They are the silent architects of discipline, shaping the way we move through life with purpose instead of impulse. When we talk about discipline, we often think of routines, waking up early, following rules, or staying focused. But discipline is far more than a checklist of actions. It's the foundation of freedom. Without principles to guide us, we're slaves to our whims, pulled in every direction by fleeting emotions. Discipline doesn't restrict us. It refines us, like a sculptor chiseling away excess stone to reveal the masterpiece within. Principles help us strip away distractions and false comforts so that we can become something greater. Yet it's important to ask, why do we need this structure at all? Why can't we just live as we please, doing whatever feels good in the moment? The answer lies in understanding the nature of our desires. Human beings are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. It's an instinct embedded deep within us. We crave rewards, recognition, ease. But if we live only according to what feels good right now, we take shortcuts, avoid challenges, and give up on dreams that require endurance. Principles step in as our internal compass, reminding us that the things worth having, peace, wisdom, strength, don't come from ease, they come from perseverance. Consider a student who dreams of mastering an art, music, writing, or athletics. Talent may give them a head start, but talent alone won't take them far. It's the discipline of practice, of showing up even when inspiration runs dry, that turns dreams into reality. Principles like commitment, patience, and focus aren't glamorous, but they're the bridge between ambition and achievement. Without them, even the most gifted individual risks mediocrity. However, principles don't just apply to personal success. They also guide our moral character, teaching us when to speak and when to stay silent, when to fight for what's right and when to walk away. Think about honesty. In theory, we all agree that honesty is a principle worth upholding. But in practice, there are moments when dishonesty feels easier. Maybe it's a small lie to avoid embarrassment or to gain a slight advantage. In those moments, our principles are tested. Do we compromise for convenience, or do we choose to live in alignment with our values? The answer to that question shapes not only how others see us, but how we see ourselves. But here's the challenge. Discipline can feel lonely. It's not always rewarded in the short term. In fact, it often goes unnoticed. When others are taking shortcuts, when they're choosing comfort over integrity, it's easy to feel like the only one playing by the rules. You may wonder, is it worth it? Why should I stay true to my principles when no one seems to care? But discipline isn't about external recognition. It's about internal mastery. It's about knowing that you stayed true to yourself regardless of who was watching. And that's what makes principles a form of quiet courage. Every day we're faced with choices, small and large, that test our resolve. Do we indulge in gossip or choose kindness? Do we rush through our responsibilities or take the time to do things well? Do we let frustration control us, or do we pause and respond with patience? These choices seem ordinary, but they're the threads that weave the fabric of our character. And when we practice discipline in the small moments, we build the strength to withstand the bigger storms. It's important to remember, though, that discipline isn't about perfection. We will stumble, we will make mistakes. And when we do, the temptation is to think we've failed and that all our efforts were for nothing. But true discipline isn't about never falling. It's about rising after every fall. It's about choosing again and again to realign with our principles, no matter how many times we've strayed. In that way, discipline becomes a practice of self-compassion as much as self-control. There's an ancient story about a monk who was known for his unwavering discipline. One day, a younger disciple asked him, "Master, how do you maintain such perfect discipline every day?" The monk smiled and said, "I don't. Some days I fail, but each morning I begin again." That's the heart of true discipline. It's not about rigidity or perfection. It's about perseverance and renewal. So, what does it mean to live with principles as life's discipline? It means understanding that freedom isn't found in doing whatever we want whenever we want. It's found in choosing what's right, even when it's hard. It means realizing that every act of discipline strengthens us for the challenges ahead. And it means trusting that principles are not chains that bind us, but anchors that keep us steady when life's winds threaten to pull us off course. In a world that often celebrates shortcuts and rewards immediate gratification, living by principles is an act of quiet rebellion. But it's a rebellion rooted in wisdom, in the understanding that the most meaningful victories are the ones we earn through patience, integrity, and discipline. And when we look back on our lives, it won't be the moments of comfort that define us. It will be the moments when we chose courage over convenience, discipline over distraction, and principles over impulse. Those moments will be the markers of a life well lived, a life not driven by fleeting desires, but guided by a steady, unshakable compass. So ask yourself, what discipline does your life call you to today? And what principles will you choose to guide you, even when no one else is watching? Comfort and growth. At the heart of every journey, there comes a moment of choice. Do we stay where it's safe, familiar, and comfortable? Or do we step into the unknown, where growth waits on the other side of discomfort? It's a question we face again and again in different ways, from the smallest daily habits to the most significant life decisions. And yet, the answer often comes down to the same fundamental struggle: the pull between comfort and growth. Comfort is seductive. It whispers that we've done enough, that rest is deserved, that the hard work can wait. And, to be fair, comfort isn't inherently bad. Rest and ease have their place in a balanced life. But comfort becomes dangerous when it holds us in place for too long, when it becomes a cocoon that shields us from the very experiences that can shape us into who we're meant to be. Growth, on the other hand, rarely feels inviting. Growth demands effort, vulnerability, and sometimes pain. It asks us to endure challenges that test our patience, confront truths that unsettle us, and release habits that no longer serve us. It pushes us to let go of certainty and step into moments where we can't predict the outcome. And because of this, growth often feels like the harder choice. But here's the paradox: the more we choose comfort, the smaller our world becomes. When we avoid growth because it feels uncomfortable, we build invisible walls around our lives. We stay in jobs that no longer inspire us because change feels risky. We hold back our opinions because speaking up might lead to conflict. We stay in routines that no longer fulfill us because they're predictable. Slowly, the desire for comfort can shrink our horizons until we're no longer truly living, we're merely existing. On the other hand, when we embrace discomfort in the name of growth, something remarkable happens. Each time we step into a space of uncertainty and challenge, we expand. Our resilience deepens, our courage strengthens, our understanding broadens, and with each experience, we discover a version of ourselves that we might not have known existed. Think of the butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. In its final stage of metamorphosis, the butterfly must struggle to break free. That struggle is necessary. It forces blood into its wings, giving it the strength to fly. If someone tries to help by cutting the chrysalis open, the butterfly's wings remain weak, unable to support its flight. The same is true for us. Without moments of struggle, our wings, our strength, may never fully develop. Consider a simple but powerful example, the discomfort of failure. Failure feels deeply uncomfortable. It stings our pride, tests our patience, and often brings waves of self-doubt. But failure is also one of life's greatest teachers. When we allow ourselves to sit with the discomfort of failure rather than run from it, we open the door to growth. We learn resilience, the ability to rise after we fall. We gain humility, the understanding that we're human and imperfect. We discover adaptability, the capacity to adjust and try again, armed with lessons from our mistakes. But comfort doesn't just pull us away from external challenges. It also shields us from internal growth. Think about emotional discomfort, the moments when we're faced with difficult conversations, unresolved pain, or inconvenient truths about ourselves. It's tempting to avoid these moments, to distract ourselves with entertainment, busyness, or surface-level interactions. But avoidance only delays healing. True growth often begins in those uncomfortable spaces of reflection and honesty, where we face what we'd rather ignore. And while it's not easy, those moments hold the potential to transform not only how we live, but how we love and connect with others. Of course, this doesn't mean we should seek discomfort for its own sake. There's a difference between intentional growth and unnecessary suffering. Growth requires discomfort with purpose, a willingness to be uncomfortable because we know it's leading somewhere meaningful. Climbing a mountain may be exhausting, but the view from the top is worth it. The same goes for the mountains in our lives. Whether it's pursuing a new career, repairing a fractured relationship, or breaking free from a harmful habit, the climb may be steep, but each step builds the strength we'll need for what comes next. There's a well-known quote that says, "A ship is safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships are built for." The same is true for us. We may feel safe staying within our comfort zones, but we're not meant to live anchored in one place. We're meant to explore, to grow, to face the waves and winds that help us become stronger navigators of our own lives. And though the journey may be uncertain, it's through this uncertainty that we find purpose and fulfillment. It's also important to acknowledge that growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it's as simple as choosing to have one uncomfortable conversation rather than avoiding it. Sometimes, it's taking one small step toward a new goal rather than waiting for the perfect moment. Growth isn't about perfection, it's about progress. It's about stretching ourselves little by little until we look back and realize how far we've come. So how do we choose growth over comfort in our daily lives? It starts with awareness, recognizing the moments when we're tempted to stay small because it's easier. It's about asking ourselves, am I avoiding this because it's not right for me or because it's uncomfortable? And when the answer is discomfort, it's about having the courage to lean in rather than step back. Ultimately, comfort may offer a moment of ease, but growth offers a lifetime of purpose. Every time we choose growth, we build a life that is richer, fuller, and more meaningful. And the most beautiful part is this: the discomfort that felt unbearable at the start eventually becomes the strength that carries us forward. The very things that challenge us today become the stories we tell tomorrow, the stories of resilience, courage, and transformation. So when you find yourself at the crossroads between comfort and growth, remember this: life's greatest rewards are often found on the other side of discomfort. Trust that every step forward, no matter how difficult, is expanding your horizons and strengthening your wings. And one day, you'll look back and see that what once felt like struggle was, in fact, your becoming. A legacy of wisdom. Throughout history, humanity has handed down stories, lessons, and principles, not as restrictions, but as gifts. These gifts are not always wrapped in ease or comfort. Sometimes they come in the form of warnings, whispered through the scars of those who came before us. Other times they are wrapped in traditions that may feel outdated until life's challenges reveal their enduring value. This is the legacy of wisdom, passed down from generation to generation, not to bind us, but to guide us. Think about the principles we inherit from our parents, mentors, and ancestors. Many of these lessons were learned the hard way, through failure, loss, sacrifice, and reflection. Perhaps your grandfather once told you that honesty matters more than short-term gain, because he learned, after making a costly mistake, that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. Perhaps your mother always insisted on kindness, even when she was treated unfairly, because she understood that cruelty creates more suffering than it ever resolves. These principles didn't come from textbooks alone. They were forged in the fire of real experience. The beauty of this legacy of wisdom is that it allows us to walk forward without repeating every mistake ourselves. Imagine if every generation had to start from scratch. If there were no recorded knowledge, no shared guidance, and no stories to remind us of what matters most, we would stumble in the dark, making the same painful mistakes that others already endured. Principles passed down through time are like lanterns on the path, illuminating dangers, shortcuts, and the steps toward a life of integrity and fulfillment. But here's the challenge. Sometimes, the wisdom of the past can feel irrelevant in the present. In a world of rapid change, we're often tempted to discard the old ways, to believe that the lessons of those before us no longer apply. After all, we live in an era of unprecedented convenience, technology, and speed. It's easy to believe we've outgrown the need for ancient principles. But wisdom isn't about relevance to trends. It's about relevance to the human condition. No matter how much the world changes, the core of the human experience, love, fear, ambition, loss, remains the same. And the principles that address these universal experiences remain timeless. Consider the principle of patience. In our fast-paced world, patience can feel outdated, like an unnecessary virtue in the age of same-day shipping and instant answers. But life's most important journeys, healing from grief, building meaningful relationships, mastering a craft, still unfold slowly in their own timelines. No amount of technology can accelerate the growth of a seed into a tree. And no shortcut can replace the quiet resilience that patience builds within us. The wisdom of patience, handed down by those who endured long winters and hard times, remains as relevant now as it ever was. Another example is the principle of humility. It's easy to forget the importance of humility in a culture that often rewards self-promotion and individualism. But those who came before us understood that true wisdom begins where arrogance ends. They learned that being teachable, open to feedback, correction, and growth creates a foundation for lasting success. Humility reminds us that we are not the center of the universe, and that wisdom often arrives when we listen more than we speak. This isn't a message that fades with time. It's one that grows more necessary as our accomplishments increase. However, the legacy of wisdom isn't meant to be followed blindly. While some principles are timeless, others may need to evolve. For example, past generations may have followed strict rules about social roles or traditions that no longer align with modern values of equality and freedom. Wisdom invites us to honor the intention behind the principle while discerning whether its form still serves us. The goal isn't to abandon tradition, but to allow it to adapt to a deeper truth. Wisdom evolves not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. There's a well-known story of a traveler who encountered a weathered bridge spanning a deep ravine. The bridge's ropes and wooden planks seemed old, but they had stood the test of time. As the traveler hesitated, an elder appeared and said, "This bridge was built by those who came before you. It may look worn, but it is strong. They built it so that you wouldn't have to find your own way across the ravine. Trust their work, but inspect the ropes for yourself." This story is a reminder that while the wisdom of the past can guide us, we must also use discernment. We honor the legacy by asking questions, learning from it, and when necessary, making repairs or adjustments. Another beautiful aspect of this legacy is that it doesn't just flow in one direction. Wisdom isn't only passed down, it's also passed forward. The principles we live by today become part of the wisdom we offer to future generations. Our actions, how we handle failure, how we treat others, how we face uncertainty, become lessons for those who watch us. Whether we realize it or not, we are always contributing to the legacy of wisdom. The question is, what kind of legacy are we leaving behind? Will we leave behind a legacy of resilience or resignation, compassion or cynicism, integrity or convenience? Every time we choose to live by principles that uphold truth, kindness, and justice, we strengthen the threads of wisdom that will be passed forward. And even though we may never see the full impact of our actions, the legacy we create lives on, quietly shaping lives in ways we may never know. So the next time you're faced with a choice, whether to take a shortcut or stay the course, whether to speak with kindness or with harshness, remember that you're not just making a decision for yourself. You're contributing to a larger story. You're adding a verse to the song of humanity's wisdom. We are all part of something bigger than ourselves. The principles we inherit and the principles we pass on form an unbroken chain of wisdom, a legacy that, if nurtured, will continue to guide, protect, and uplift those who come after us. Principles in relationships. At the heart of every meaningful connection, whether between friends, family, or even strangers, are principles that act as invisible threads, holding the relationship together. These principles guide the way we speak, listen, and respond to one another. In relationships, principles such as respect, honesty, empathy, and boundaries become vital because they protect not only our individuality, but also the shared space where relationships grow. Without principles, relationships can quickly unravel. Trust is replaced by suspicion. Communication becomes tangled in assumptions and half-truths, and love, whether platonic or romantic, begins to erode under the weight of unresolved misunderstandings. Principles act as anchors that keep relationships steady, even when emotions run high. Respecting boundaries and individuality. One of the most foundational principles in any relationship is respect. especially respect for boundaries. We often assume that those closest to us will automatically understand and honor our needs and limits. But the truth is, no two people, no matter how close, are the same. Each person carries their own experiences, values, and emotional triggers. Principles remind us that we must never take another person's boundaries for granted. Respect means acknowledging that someone's no deserves as much respect as their yes. Consider how easy it is to cross someone's emotional boundary without realizing it. Cutting someone off mid-sentence because we think we know what they're going to say, or dismissing their concerns because they don't seem important to us. These moments may seem small, but over time, they can chip away at the foundation of trust. Respect as a principle teaches us to listen fully, to pause before reacting, and to value someone's feelings, even when they're different from our own. The principle of honesty, building and rebuilding trust. Honesty is another cornerstone principle that holds relationships together. But honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's about being authentic. It's about showing up as we truly are, rather than as we think we're supposed to be. In a world where appearances often matter more than substance, it can be tempting to wear masks, to say what others want to hear, or to hide our vulnerabilities out of fear of judgment. But honesty creates trust, and trust is the foundation of intimacy. Without it, even the strongest relationships can become fragile. However, honesty must also be tempered with compassion. There's a difference between being truthful and being harsh. A principle-guided approach to honesty means telling the truth in a way that uplifts rather than wounds, that seeks resolution rather than revenge. When trust is broken, it can feel as though the relationship itself has shattered. But principles remind us that trust, while fragile, can be rebuilt. Rebuilding trust requires time, consistent actions, and a commitment to honesty, not just about what happened, but about what will change moving forward. When both parties are willing to live by these principles, even broken bonds can heal. The principle of empathy, seeing through another's eyes. Empathy is the principle that allows us to step outside of ourselves and see the world through someone else's eyes. It doesn't mean we will always agree, but it does mean that we make the effort to understand where the other person is coming from. In relationships, empathy transforms conflict into connection. Instead of viewing the other person as an opponent, we see them as someone who is trying, just like us, to be heard, understood, and respected. But empathy takes practice. It requires us to pause before reacting and to ask, what might this person be feeling right now? When we practice empathy, we soften our judgments and approach situations with curiosity rather than defensiveness. This principle helps us remember that beneath the surface of any disagreement, there is often fear, frustration, or hurt that longs to be acknowledged. Boundaries protect, not divide. Many people fear that setting boundaries will drive others away, that saying no will be seen as rejection. But the truth is, healthy boundaries are acts of care for ourselves and for others. Boundaries define where one person ends and another begins. They prevent resentment from festering and ensure that relationships remain balanced rather than one-sided. Think of boundaries as fences, not walls. Fences mark where someone can enter respectfully, while walls block everything out. A principle-based relationship honors fences, not to keep people out, but to ensure that both people feel respected and safe within the relationship. Boundaries allow relationships to thrive because they make expectations clear, reduce misunderstandings, and promote mutual respect. Navigating conflict with principles. No relationship is free from conflict, but the way we navigate conflict reveals whether we're living by principles or emotions alone. When we argue without principles, conflict can become destructive, marked by blame, defensiveness, and the need to win. But when we approach conflict with principles like respect, empathy, and a commitment to resolution, conflict becomes a doorway to deeper understanding. This doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations or pretending everything is fine. It means speaking with honesty but also with patience, listening with the intention to understand rather than to respond. It means knowing when to stand firm on values and when to compromise without sacrificing self-respect. Relationships built on principles aren't free from disagreements. They're strengthened by how disagreements are handled. The danger of one-sided principles. It's important to remember that principles must be mutual to truly sustain a relationship. When one person lives by principles of respect, honesty, and empathy, but the other does not, the relationship becomes unbalanced. In these situations, we may feel tempted to lower our standards or abandon our principles just to keep the peace. But abandoning our values can lead to resentment and self-betrayal. Principles remind us that healthy relationships must be built on mutual effort and respect, and when they aren't, it's sometimes necessary to step back, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of self-respect. Foundation for lasting connection. Ultimately, principles in relationships are not rigid rules. They're guidelines for love, respect, and authenticity. They remind us that relationships are not about control or perfection, but about creating spaces where both people feel seen, heard, and valued. Principles help us navigate the messiness of being human together, offering grace in moments of failure and humility in moments of pride. When we choose to live by principles, we set a standard, not only for how we treat others, but for how we expect to be treated in return. And when both people commit to living by principles, relationships become places of safety and growth rather than competition and fear. They become spaces where we don't just exist together, we thrive together. In the end, the quality of our relationships reflects the quality of the principles we uphold within them. So, as we move forward in life, let us ask ourselves, what principles guide the way we connect, love, and grow with others? And are we creating relationships that nurture, inspire, and honor not only who we are today, but who we are becoming? The balance between flexibility and rigidity. In life, few things are as important or as difficult as finding balance. One of the most delicate balancing acts is between flexibility and rigidity. We often see these two qualities as opposites. Rigidity is associated with strength and resolve, while flexibility is tied to adaptability and openness. But in truth, they aren't enemies. They are two sides of the same coin, and when used wisely together, they create a life guided by principles yet capable of growth. Imagine a tree standing in a storm. The strongest trees aren't the ones that resist every gust of wind. They're the ones that know when to bend without breaking. Similarly, in our lives, there are moments when standing firm is necessary and moments when yielding is wise. The challenge is knowing when to do which. When rigidity becomes a barrier. Rigidity at its best is about conviction. A commitment to our values and principles. It helps us stay grounded when temptation or chaos tries to pull us away from what's right. But when rigidity becomes extreme, it can turn into stubbornness, closing us off from new ideas, experiences, and growth. It can make us resistant to change, even when change is exactly what's needed. Think of relationships where one person refuses to compromise because they believe their way is the only way, or workplaces where old methods are followed simply because that's how it's always been done, even though they no longer serve a purpose. Rigidity in these cases doesn't strengthen, it isolates. It builds walls where bridges are needed. Principles are meant to guide us, not to harden us to the point where we can no longer connect or evolve. There's a story in Zen philosophy about a master who holds up a brittle, dry stick and snaps it in half. Then he bends a green reed that flexes easily and returns to its original shape. Which one survives? The master asks. This simple lesson reminds us that unyielding rigidity, no matter how strong it seems, will eventually break. Rigidity without awareness becomes fragility in disguise. The danger of too much flexibility. On the other hand, excessive flexibility can also be a problem. While flexibility allows us to adapt to circumstances, too much of it can erode our sense of self and our commitment to our values. When we bend too easily in the face of pressure or persuasion, we risk losing sight of what matters most. We can become people who say yes to everything to avoid conflict, or who change our principles to fit in with every new trend or opinion. Consider someone who compromises their values just to maintain harmony in a group. They might avoid speaking up against injustice because they fear confrontation. While they may feel temporary relief from avoiding tension, over time this kind of flexibility can lead to regret, resentment, and a sense of betrayal, both of themselves and their principles. True flexibility isn't about abandoning your beliefs whenever it's convenient. It's about knowing when and how to adjust without losing your core. It's the art of recognizing that sometimes the strongest stance is not resistance, but resilience. The wisdom to discern is how do we know when to be flexible and when to stand firm? This is where wisdom and self-awareness come into play. There are times when sticking to our principles, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular, is essential. For example, standing up for honesty in a situation where deceit is rewarded. In such moments, our resolve defines our character. But there are also times when holding too tightly to a principle can cause harm rather than good. Imagine someone refusing to forgive because they believe justice demands punishment. While the principle of accountability is valid, unyielding rigidity can close the door to healing, connection, and understanding. The key is discernment. Before reacting, we can ask ourselves questions like, am I holding firm because this principle truly aligns with my values, or because I'm afraid of change? Is my flexibility a sign of strength, or am I compromising out of fear or convenience? Will standing firm in this moment lead to growth and respect, or will it create unnecessary division? These questions help us pause, reflect, and make decisions that are neither impulsive nor stubborn. Instead, they are thoughtful choices guided by both principle and awareness of the context. Learning from nature, the river, and the rock. One of the most beautiful metaphors for this balance is the relationship between a river and the rocks it flows over. The rocks remain steady, they don't chase the current or change direction. But the river isn't weak because it moves. It is persistent, flowing around obstacles, carving its path without losing its essence. Over time, even the hardest stones are shaped by the gentle but consistent movement of water. This is the balance we must seek, the ability to be steadfast without becoming stagnant, to move with life's currents without losing who we are. The consequences of imbalance. When we lean too far toward rigidity, we risk alienating others and missing out on opportunities for growth. We become isolated, trapped in a fortress of our own making. But when we become too flexible, we can lose our sense of self, becoming reactive instead of proactive, shapeless instead of grounded. History offers countless examples of both extremes. Leaders who were too rigid in their beliefs often led their people into conflict and ruin because they refused to adapt to changing circumstances. Meanwhile, leaders who were too eager to please everyone often lacked direction and integrity, leaving behind legacies of confusion and instability. Applying balance to everyday life. In our everyday lives, this balance plays out in both small and significant ways. When facing disagreements with a loved one, it's easy to insist on being right. But principles remind us to ask, What matters more, the argument or the relationship? There are times when standing firm is necessary, but there are also times when being flexible enough to listen and understand shows far greater strength. In our careers, there may be moments when we need to defend our boundaries, such as saying no to unhealthy workloads. But there may also be moments when stepping outside our comfort zones can lead to growth and new opportunities. Balance means knowing when to hold the line and when to stretch. Finding strength in balance. Ultimately, the balance between flexibility and rigidity is not about perfection. It's about practice. It's about learning from moments when we were too rigid or too flexible and using those lessons to make wiser choices moving forward. True strength lies in knowing that we don't have to be one or the other. We can be both. We can be rooted and resilient, steady and adaptable. In the end, life rarely rewards those who are unbending or those who are aimless. Instead, it uplifts those who learn to flow with the current while staying true to the core of who they are. When we master this balance, we don't just survive life's storms, we thrive in them. So, the next time you face a decision, ask yourself, am I being rigid where I should bend, or am I bending where I should stand firm? The answers to these questions will shape not only the outcome of that moment, but also the legacy of strength, wisdom, and grace you leave behind. The danger of rejecting principles. In a world that often glorifies independence and self-expression, the idea of following principles can sometimes feel outdated, like a relic from a past that no longer applies to modern life. We hear phrases like, "follow your heart," or "live by your own rules." And while there's beauty in individuality, there's also a hidden danger in rejecting principles altogether. When we cast aside the foundational values that anchor our lives, we may gain temporary freedom, but at the cost of direction, stability, and ultimately, peace. Freedom without boundaries. At first glance, living without principles can feel liberating. It's the thrill of being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, without the constraints of rules or expectations. But this kind of freedom is an illusion. Imagine a ship at sea with no compass, no map, and no destination in mind. For a while, the open waters might feel exhilarating, but eventually, the ship will drift aimlessly, vulnerable to every wave and storm. In the same way, a life without principles may seem free, but it is directionless, making us more susceptible to the unpredictable tides of emotion, impulse, and external influence. Principles act as anchors in a sea of uncertainty. They give us a sense of purpose when everything around us feels chaotic. They remind us of who we want to be, not just when life is easy, but when we're faced with temptation, conflict, or fear. When we reject these guiding anchors, we may find ourselves at the mercy of our fleeting desires, making choices that satisfy us in the moment but cause regret in the long run. The myth of invincibility. Most of the reasons people reject principles is the belief that they don't need them, that they are somehow above the rules that others live by. We see this in individuals who have achieved great success or possess extraordinary talent. They may believe that their achievements exempt them from the basic principles that govern relationships, integrity, or accountability. But success without principles is like a house built on sand. It may stand for a time, but it will not endure when the foundation is tested. History is full of cautionary tales of individuals who rose to fame, wealth, or power only to fall spectacularly because they believed they could live outside the bounds of honesty, humility, and responsibility. Their stories remind us that talent and ambition may open doors, but principles keep those doors from closing on us. Without principles, even the most gifted among us can become undone by their own unchecked impulses. The slow erosion of trust. Another hidden danger of rejecting principles is the slow erosion of trust, not just with others, but with ourselves. Trust is built when our actions consistently align with our values, but when we act according to convenience rather than conviction, we send a message to others and to ourselves that we cannot be counted on. Each time we break a promise, abandon a commitment, or choose self-interest over fairness, we weaken the bonds of trust. Once lost, trust is difficult to rebuild. A person who rejects principles in pursuit of short-term gain may find themselves isolated in the long run, surrounded by people who no longer believe their words or intentions. And worse yet, they may find it difficult to trust themselves, to believe in their own ability to make sound ethical choices. This is a heavy burden to bear, as it creates a life built on uncertainty and self-doubt. The allure of rebellion. For some, rejecting principles is a way of rebelling against tradition or authority. They may view principles as restrictive, outdated rules designed to control rather than liberate. But there is a difference between healthy questioning and reckless rebellion. While it's true that some principles must be re-examined and refined over time, rejecting all principles simply for the sake of being different can lead to chaos. There's a temptation to believe that by breaking the rules, we're somehow proving our individuality or asserting our independence. But true strength doesn't come from defying principles. It comes from understanding which principles are worth upholding and which ones need to evolve. Rebellion for its own sake often becomes a form of self-sabotage, leaving us directionless and disconnected from a deeper sense of purpose. The cost of self-indulgence. When we reject principles in favor of instant gratification or indulgence, we may gain temporary pleasure, but we often pay a steep price in terms of long-term fulfillment. Imagine someone who chooses to prioritize success at any cost, cutting corners, betraying trust, or ignoring their health. They may achieve material success, but at what cost? Their relationships may become strained. Their peace of well-being may deteriorate. Principles like honesty, balance, and self-discipline may seem restrictive at first, but they actually protect us from the consequences of short-sighted decisions. They remind us to pause, reflect, and choose actions that align not just with what we want in the moment, but with who we want to become in the future. The importance of self-accountability. Living by principles isn't about adhering to rigid rules. It's about holding ourselves accountable to our own higher standards. It's about recognizing that freedom without responsibility leads to chaos, while responsibility without freedom leads to rigidity. The sweet spot is found in living a life where our choices are intentional, where we hold ourselves to principles not because we have to, but because we know they lead to a life of greater meaning and peace. Self-accountability allows us to navigate life's challenges with clarity and confidence. When we make mistakes, and we will, principles remind us that failure isn't the end. They guide us back to the path of growth, helping us learn and correct course, rather than spiral into guilt or denial. Without principles, mistakes can become patterns, and patterns can become prisons. Returning to principles. The beauty of principles is that it's never too late to return to them. Even if we've drifted far off course, principles offer a way back. A way to rebuild trust, reclaim self-respect, and restore balance. This return requires humility, the willingness to acknowledge where we've strayed, and courage, the strength to live by our values even when it's difficult. But in choosing to realign with our principles, we rediscover a sense of inner peace that cannot be found through shortcuts or rebellion. A life rooted in meaning. Rejecting principles may seem like freedom at first, but true freedom comes from living a life guided by values that uphold integrity, purpose, and compassion. Principles don't exist to confine us, they exist to elevate us. They remind us that a life of meaning isn't built on impulsive choices, but on intentional actions that reflect who we are at our core. So, As you move through life's crossroads, remember this: principles are not the chains that bind you, they are the compass that guides you. And while it may be tempting to live without them, the real danger isn't in being bound by principles, it's in being lost without them. Beyond judgment, compassion, and redemption. It's easy to pass judgment. When someone makes a mistake or falls short of our expectations, the natural reaction is often disappointment, anger, or blame. We create categories of right and wrong, good and bad, as if the world were that simple. But life rarely fits neatly into those boxes. People are more than their worst decisions, and true wisdom asks us to look beyond judgment, toward compassion and the possibility of redemption. Principles guide us in defining what is right and wrong, but they also teach us something deeper, that no one is perfect. We all fall short of our own values at times. What defines us is not whether we stumble, but how we rise after we fall, and whether we allow others the grace to rise as well. The burden of perfection. All of the reasons we are quick to judge others is because we sometimes hold ourselves to impossible standards. We believe that if we can stay perfect, we will be worthy of love, respect, and belonging. And when we see someone else fail, we project our own fear of failure onto them. We judge them harshly because we fear being judged ourselves. But this mindset is not only exhausting, it's unkind. The truth is, no one lives without mistakes. The kindest, strongest, and most principled people in the world have failed at something, betrayed a value, hurt someone unintentionally, or acted out of fear. To deny this reality is to deny our shared humanity. Compassion begins when we understand that to be human is to be imperfect. It's not our mistakes that define us, it's how we choose to respond to them. The power of compassion. Compassion doesn't mean ignoring wrongdoing or pretending that mistakes don't matter. It means acknowledging someone's humanity, even when they've fallen short. It's the ability to see someone's pain behind their actions, their potential behind their failures. Compassion doesn't excuse bad behavior, it calls people back to their best selves. Think of a time when someone offered you grace when you didn't deserve it. Perhaps you missed a deadline at work, forgot an important commitment, or spoke out of turn in anger. Instead of punishing you, that person chose to listen, to understand. And because of their compassion, you didn't sink deeper into guilt. You found the strength to make things right. Compassion can be a lifeline that pulls someone from the edge of despair back to the path of redemption. The story of the monk and the thief. There's an old story about a monastery where a young monk had a habit of stealing from his brothers. Time and again he was caught and forgiven, but the other monks grew tired of his behavior. One day, after the monk stole something precious, the brothers came to the master and demanded that the thief be expelled. "If he stays, we will leave," they warned. The master, calm as ever, replied, "You are all wise and strong. You can thrive anywhere. But this monk is still lost. If I cast him out, who will guide him back?" The master's response confused and frustrated the others, but over time they began to understand. The monastery was not meant to be a place of perfection, but a place of transformation. The thief did not need punishment, he needed guidance, and true guidance requires compassion. This story reminds us that compassion doesn't weaken our principles. It strengthens them by grounding them in love rather than fear. Justice and redemption. In many cultures, justice is seen as the opposite of mercy, as if holding someone accountable and offering them redemption are mutually exclusive. But justice and compassion are not enemies. True justice acknowledges wrongdoing, but also leaves space for growth. It offers not only consequences, but also the opportunity to make amends. Redemption doesn't mean erasing the past, it means learning from it. When we extend compassion, we're not condoning harmful actions, we're inviting transformation. We're saying, I see your mistake, but I also see your potential. It's an invitation to repair what was broken, not an excuse to ignore the damage. Self-judgment and forgiveness. Compassion and redemption aren't only for others, they're for ourselves as well. Often the person we judge most harshly is the one staring back at us in the mirror. We replay our mistakes, relive our regrets, and hold ourselves hostage to guilt. But if we cannot offer ourselves compassion, how can we offer it to others? Self-forgiveness is not about denying accountability. It's about acknowledging our mistakes, learning from them, and giving ourselves permission to move forward. Redemption begins within. When we practice self-compassion, we begin to understand that growth is a journey, not a destination. We remind ourselves that we are not defined by our worst days, but by our commitment to becoming better. Choosing grace over judgment. Choosing compassion over judgment doesn't mean abandoning principles. It means embodying them with greater depth. Principles like honesty, justice, and accountability remain vital, but they must be infused with empathy. It's easy to punish and walk away. It's harder and braver to stay and help someone rebuild. Consider what might happen if we approached conflict with curiosity rather than condemnation. Instead of asking, "How could you do this?" we ask, "What led you to this?" Instead of assuming the worst, we listen for the truth behind someone's pain. This doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior. It means believing that even those who've made mistakes are capable of change. The ripple effect of compassion. Compassion has a ripple effect. When we extend grace to someone, they carry that grace forward in their interactions with others. A single act of understanding can inspire a chain of kindness and second chances. In contrast, judgment often leads to shame and isolation, which only deepen the cycle of mistakes and regret. In families, workplaces, and communities, we can choose to cultivate a culture of compassion, one where people feel safe to acknowledge their flaws and grow from them. This doesn't mean avoiding accountability. It means offering accountability with kindness, believing that every person has the potential for redemption if they are given the right support. Redemption as a path to connection. In the end, compassion and redemption remind us of a simple but profound truth. We are all connected. When we judge harshly, we build walls between ourselves and others. But when we choose compassion, we build bridges of understanding, forgiveness, and hope. Redemption isn't just about healing the person who made the mistake. It's about healing the relationship between them and the world. The next time someone falls short, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or even yourself, pause and ask, what does this moment need? Punishment or a path forward? Judgment may feel satisfying in the moment, but it rarely leads to peace. Compassion, on the other hand, opens the door to transformation. And when we choose redemption over rejection, we make room for the possibility of something beautiful, a second chance. Principles as a reflection of understanding. Principles are often viewed as rigid rules, things we follow without question because we've been told they're the right way to live. But true principles, those that stand the test of time, are not blind rules. They are reflections of our deepest understanding of ourselves, others, and the world. They don't exist to impose control, but to reveal wisdom. When we live by meaningful principles, we aren't just following instructions. We're expressing a profound awareness of what nurtures peace, balance, and growth. Understanding shapes principles. At their core, principles are not meant to be a list of do's and don'ts handed down without reason. They are born from observation, reflection, and experience. Each principle we follow is, in some way, an acknowledgement of a lesson learned, by us or by those who came before us. These lessons are reminders of what happens when we act impulsively, selfishly, or recklessly. Principles reflect the wisdom gained from recognizing what helps us thrive and what causes unnecessary suffering. Take, for example, the principle of honesty. It exists not because someone arbitrarily decided that lying is bad, but because generations of human experience have shown that dishonesty erodes trust, weakens relationships, and breeds insecurity. When we live by honesty, we aren't merely obeying a rule, we are embodying an understanding that trust and integrity create stronger connections and a more harmonious life. Principles and self-awareness. Living by principles also requires self-awareness. We cannot blindly follow principles without understanding their purpose, just as we cannot abandon them whenever they become inconvenient. When we adopt principles without reflection, they can feel like burdens, rigid constraints that limit our freedom. But when we understand why a principle exists, it becomes empowering rather than restrictive. Consider someone who commits to patience. At first, they may see it as a frustrating practice, something they have to do to be seen as a good person. But as they deepen their understanding, they may come to realize that patience isn't about passivity or weakness. It's about creating space for reflection, avoiding regretful reactions, and nurturing resilience. This shift in understanding transforms patience from a rule into a source of inner peace and strength. Principles, therefore, mirror our level of understanding. When we approach them with mindfulness, they become tools for growth. When we approach them with resistance or blind adherence, they can feel like cages. The difference lies not in the principle itself, but in how deeply we understand its purpose. Principles in relationships. Principles also reflect our understanding of others. When we live by principles such as respect, empathy, and fairness, we acknowledge that everyone we encounter has their own struggles, needs, and perspectives. We understand that relationships cannot thrive in the absence of mutual care and consideration. For example, the principle of active listening exists because understanding cannot occur in a one-sided conversation. It reflects the truth that to truly connect with someone, we must listen, not just to respond, but to understand. By practicing this principle, we're not simply following a rule of etiquette. We're demonstrating an understanding that every person has a story, and that listening is an act of kindness and validation. When we live without relational principles, we run the risk of viewing others as obstacles or tools rather than as complex, valuable individuals. This can lead to misunderstandings, resentment, and loneliness. But when we act with understanding, when our principles reflect an awareness of the human experience, we create relationships rooted in respect and trust. The dangers of misunderstood principles. However, principles can also be misunderstood or misapplied. Sometimes we may cling to a principle in a way that causes more harm than good. For example, the principle of justice is essential. It holds people accountable for their actions and ensures fairness. But when justice is pursued without compassion, it can become punitive rather than corrective. Instead of creating healing and resolution, it can create fear and division. This is why principles must always be accompanied by wisdom and discernment. It's not enough to say, "I'm doing the right thing because it follows the rule." We must ask ourselves, does this action align with the deeper purpose of the principle? True understanding allows us to see that principles are meant to guide us toward balance, not absolutes that leave no room for nuance or grace. Personal principles and growth. Principles also evolve as our understanding deepens. The principles we live by at different stages of life may shift as we grow. What we believe to be true in our youth may become more refined as we encounter life's complexities. For example, someone might begin their journey with the principle of self-reliance, believing that independence is the ultimate goal. But as they grow, they may come to understand the value of interdependence, the strength found in mutual support and collaboration. This doesn't mean that earlier principles were wrong. It means they were stepping stones on the path to deeper wisdom. Growth doesn't discard principles, it deepens them. It shifts them from rigid rules to living reflections of understanding. When we allow our principles to grow with us, they become not chains that bind us, but roots that ground us. Understanding the purpose of boundaries. One powerful example of how understanding shapes principles is the principle of boundaries. Without understanding, boundaries can seem like selfish walls meant to shut others out. But when we reflect, we realize that healthy boundaries are acts of self-respect and protection. They create the space needed for trust and mutual respect to flourish. Similarly, the principle of forgiveness may seem like a way to excuse harm until we realize that forgiveness isn't about condoning hurtful behavior. It's about freeing ourselves from the burden of resentment. Principles like these reflect an evolving understanding that strength and softness, justice and mercy can coexist in a balanced life. Living by principles with humility. Living by principles requires humility, the willingness to admit when we don't fully understand and the openness to learn. We don't always get it right. There are times when we may rigidly enforce a principle only to later realize that we misunderstood its purpose. But humility allows us to adjust without losing sight of our values. It reminds us that principles are not about appearing righteous, they are about becoming wise. When we live with humility, we recognize that principles are not trophies, they're tools. They guide us when we feel lost, center us when we feel overwhelmed, and challenge us when we become complacent. They reflect not only what we know, but what we aspire to become. The mirror of our principles. In the end, principles are mirrors that reflect our understanding of life's deepest truths. They show us who we are when life tests us and who we strive to be when no one is watching. They remind us that living well isn't about perfection, it's about alignment. When our principles come from a place of understanding, they become more than rules to follow. They become a way of life rooted in wisdom, compassion, and integrity. So as you reflect on your own principles, ask yourself, do they reflect fear or do they reflect understanding? Are they imposed or are they chosen? And most importantly, do they guide you toward a life of meaning, connection, and peace? The lesson. And in reflecting on principles, we've come to see that they are more than rules. They are reflections of our aspirations and our understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. They guide us through the complexities of human experience, offering us a way to stay grounded in truth while navigating the ever-changing tides of emotion, circumstance, and relationships. But principles, in and of themselves, are not the destination. They are the map. The true journey is one of growth, compassion, and self-awareness. Principles as a path, not a prison. One of the most important lessons about principles is that they are meant to serve us, not imprison us. When followed without thought or understanding, principles can become rigid, stripping away our humanity and empathy. We see this when someone clings to rightness at the expense of connection, refusing to compromise or forgive because they believe it would make them weak. But principles that are rooted in wisdom and flexibility remind us that doing what is right doesn't always look like following the rules to the letter. It often means acting with grace, patience, and discernment. Life doesn't ask us to choose between being principled and being kind. It calls us to integrate both. True strength lies in the ability to uphold principles with humility, knowing when to stand firm and when to soften. This is not a contradiction. It is the balance that defines a life of integrity. The courage to reflect and adapt. Another lesson we draw from principles is the importance of reflection. Principles, when unexamined, can lead to self-righteousness or stagnation. But when we take time to reflect, we can ask ourselves whether the principles we live by still serve the person we are becoming. Are they helping us grow, or have they become shields we use to avoid discomfort? Are they guiding us toward peace and connection, or are they isolating us from others and our own growth? Consider someone who has always valued independence as a principle. This principle may have served them well in the past, helping them build resilience and confidence. But as life shifts, perhaps with new relationships or unexpected hardships, they may find that rigid independence limits their ability to accept support and cultivate deeper bonds. In this moment of reflection, the person is faced with a choice: to cling to independence as an unchanging rule, or to adapt their principle to reflect a deeper understanding of interdependence. This process doesn't weaken their values, it strengthens them by aligning principles with life's evolving truths. Principles as an expression of compassion. One of the most profound lessons about principles is that they are not just about how we treat ourselves, they are about how we treat others. Principles like honesty, respect, patience, and empathy are not there to make us appear noble. They are there to remind us of the importance of connection. In every interaction, we are given a choice to build walls or to build bridges. Principles rooted in compassion help us choose the latter. It's easy to hold ourselves and others to impossible standards. When someone stumbles, whether it's a loved one, a stranger, or even ourselves, it's tempting to rush to judgment. But principles like forgiveness and understanding remind us that people are more than their mistakes. They remind us that redemption is possible, not because we ignore wrongdoing, but because we believe in the potential for growth. Compassion is not a rejection of justice, it is its deepest expression. It says, "I see your fault, but I also see your worth." Freedom through responsibility. Another key lesson is that principles offer true freedom, not through recklessness, but through responsibility. It's a paradox, but it's true. When we live without guiding principles, we may feel free for a while, but that freedom often leads to chaos, regret, and self-doubt. By contrast, when we choose to live by principles that reflect our values, we free ourselves from impulsivity and the burden of regret. Responsibility isn't a limitation, it's a liberation. It allows us to live with clarity and peace, knowing that our choices align with our highest ideals. Living a life of meaning. Ultimately, the lesson of principles is that they lead us toward a life of meaning. Meaning doesn't come from perfection, it comes from intention. When we live with principles, we may still make mistakes, but we will live with purpose. Our relationships will be shaped not by convenience, but by care. Our work will be driven not by ambition alone, but by integrity. And our quiet moments, those moments when no one is watching, will be filled not with doubt or shame, but with a quiet sense of self-respect. A life without principles may feel easy at times, but it is often empty. A life with principles may be challenging, but it is rich with purpose and fulfillment. The way we live, how we choose to speak, act, and respond, becomes our legacy. And when we live guided by principles rooted in understanding, compassion, and resilience, that legacy is one of love, respect, and trust. The ongoing journey. The journey of living by principles is not a straight line. It is a lifelong practice. There will be times when we falter, when we make choices that stray from our values. But each misstep is an invitation to return to our principles, to reflect and realign. Principles remind us that life is not about never falling. It's about rising again with a clearer sense of who we are and who we want to be. So as you move forward, ask yourself, what principles guide your life? Do they reflect fear or understanding? Are they imposed or are they chosen? And most importantly, do they help you create a life of connection, peace, and meaning? Remember, principles are not the end, they are the beginning. They are not the goal, they are the compass. And when used wisely, They point us toward a life that is not only successful in the eyes of others, but deeply fulfilling in the quiet of our own hearts.